I am delighted to introduce Christi Bell, who is Associate Vice Chancellor of the Business Enterprise Institute at the University of Alaska Anchorage, who will moderate a panel on Arctic energy-enabled economic development. Christi, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you again to the Atlantic Council and Idaho National Laboratory for all they've done to bring this event together. So it is my pleasure to introduce what I think is just a rock star panel and really gets to the heart of the matter for me. It's so important that we, as a state in particular, figure out how we link and align our military's needs, our private sector needs, our utility needs, our native corporation needs, and this panel really brings that to the discussion. So I look forward to working with these gentlemen on this panel. Florence is right here to my left. He's President and Chief Executive Officer of Doyon Utilities. Haven Harris is on the end. He's Vice President for Corporate Development, and he's with Bering Straits Native Corporation. And then Lieutenant General retired Eric Wesley and former Commanding General for the U.S. Army Futures Command is with us. And I'm going to let each of you give a little bit more of an introduction.
So, thank you, Christi. Are we on? I think. Okay, so, and I'll be very brief. So I'm pretty new to Alaska. I've only been here for 4 years. Came up to Fairbanks to lead the utility company that Christi mentioned, Doyon Utilities. But I'm a 30-plus year power plant operator, about half nuclear, half fossil. And so I've seen a lot of the various technologies and various iterations, and was delighted when I came up here to Alaska to find that Alaska is a hotbed of micronuclear development, and have tried to lend support and do what I can to help the efforts of this industry.
So as a caveat, I'm not a nuclear engineer, and nor am I an economist. Christi found me on the street and asked me if I wasn't busy. I spent 38 years in the Army, and so I'm probably a practitioner of bureaucracy to a degree. More importantly, I was an operator throughout the time I was in the military. The last 5 years I spent developing what we would describe as the future Army. And it became apparent to us that clearly there's a exponential spike in energy demand on the part of soldiers. And you're only going to get a marginal gain in any liquid fuel improvement. The other thing is, and many might not know this, is that the biggest challenge for any theater commander it isn't tactics, it's not targeting, it's not operations, really it's moving energy on the battlefield. And that problem and that challenge inspired me, and got to meet Dr. Waxman with the Pele program and have been involved in it since, and particularly its requirements and applications.
Well, my name's Haven Harris. I'm, as said, Vice President of Corporate Development for the Bering Straits Native Corporation. We're one of the 12 regional corporations here in Alaska founded at the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. We represent the people of the Seward Peninsula area. We have about 2.1 million acres. And today we have 8,100 shareholders and about another 17,000 descendants. So we basically represent a membership worldwide of about 25,000 people. I was born and raised in Nome. I lived there until about 15 years ago. So I think I bring a very rural, off-the-road system focus to this discussion that, frankly, is vitally important for the development of both of our resources and the continuance of our traditional ways of life in Alaska. I really firmly believe that a vital, strong Alaska, rural Alaska, villages, guarantees a strong urban Alaska. I don't believe a strong urban Alaska does anything to guarantee a strong rural Alaska. And I've held that belief since working in the Alaska State Legislature, working for tribal-based organizations, healthcare organizations, and now almost 10 years with my regional corporation. My family is originally from the White Mountain Fish River area, the Upuk family. My Inupiaq name is Anamak, and in addition to being at the Bering Straits Native Corporation, I'm a tribally enrolled member of the Nome Eskimo community and a former board member of the Sitnesok Native Corporation. So I'm hoping to bring kind of that feeling and tone of what it's like living and being an end user of resources, off the road system to this discussion, and also an organization that wants to continue investing in our own region and our people.
Thank you very much. And you're also grew up in Nome?
Born and raised.
Born and raised.
Yep.
Yep. I love that perspective that you're bringing. All right. So as many of you already know, I'm an economic development practitioner. What does that mean? It means that I'm really interested in how we're going to create wealth for our state and how that wealth is going to result in jobs and prosperity and greater resiliency. And so when I'm approaching this, I'm thinking about those types of things. And when I consider the possibility of having a safe, proven, reliable, and hopefully affordable energy source, I just get super excited because I've spent 30 years looking at economic development opportunities across our state, and frankly, energy and workforce tend to be the two obstacles that we routinely hit. So I'm excited about the unique opportunities that this new nuclear offers, and what it might bring to Alaska communities and our business communities. And I share your feelings, Haven. I think, we need to have a strong rural, remote Alaska, and that there's a tremendous opportunity with that. So I want to dive into what your vision is. How might we accomplish some of these goals that we've heard about today? So I'm going to start it off with you first, Lou. And you bring decades of applied nuclear experience and serve as one of Alaska's larger hub communities, or serve one of Alaska's hub communities. You also provide leadership to a utility. What are you considering as the potential uses and applications for new nuclear? And what are your thoughts and concerns?
So, thanks, Christy. I think everybody here is probably familiar with the basic use cases, but I'll try to give them a little bit of a different character. So the first use case is really critical infrastructure. And that starts, I think, the most obvious instance is the military installations. So from the Department of Defense's perspective, resiliency in the way that the Department of Defense defines it, which is the outside utilities go away and the installations have to be independent and able to produce their own electricity and water and energy. So resiliency and security, you have to be able to actually protect the asset, are paramount. And so from a resiliency and a security perspective, nuclear provides a tremendous option. If you go around many installations that the military has throughout the United States, you'll find that resiliency is often provided in the form of fossil fuels, oil tanks, 10 days, 14 days. With a nuclear option, there's super resiliency, if you will. But this capability for critical infrastructure goes beyond just the military applications, of which there are many in Alaska. It could go to hospitals, communication centers, other pieces of critical infrastructure where you don't need a gigawatt-sized reactor, but some of these micronuclear plants, or even the smaller ones, the kind of the mini micronuclear plants, might be just the right size for some of the smaller applications. So that seems like the first and most obvious use case. The second one has also been discussed here, and that's out in the off the connected grid locations. So President Pitney was up here before, and she mentioned that basically the only electrical grid in Alaska of any size, and it's not very big, to be honest, is the rail belt connected grid going from Homer up to Fairbanks. Everywhere else is essentially off the grid, and each of those is a potential use case for micronuclear because of resiliency and also because of cost. So the costs to generate and maintain generating equipment in rural Alaska and even in some of the bigger cities throughout Alaska can become very high. Where people in the lower 48 might be used to spending 15 cents a kilowatt hour, Fairbanks, Anchorage, we're close to 20, 25 cents. These communities might be $1 and even higher in some cases. So it's very high cost, where nuclear options, just on the cost estimates alone, would seem to be advantageous today. The third use case for nuclear in Alaska is really grid connected on the rail belt. And I think only in the context of decarbonization is where that becomes more viable. Right now, each of the rail belt utilities within Alaska is organized as a cooperative, and those co-op boards look very hard at costs. And right now, micronuclear does not, or even small modular nuclear, does not pencil out for them. And so we don't see nuclear projects on the board. So there are two clear use cases that should work today, and that is critical infrastructure on the military installations and in remote locations. And really the, the concern, to answer the second part of your question, Christi, is, well, you know, why haven't we filled the reactor vendors' order books, right? Why isn't there a backlog? Why isn't this stuff ordered and being produced? And when I think about that, and again, I've only had a few years exposure to this, but there's an awful lot of discussion going on. I've assembled a certain kind of overall picture. I think there are three things that really are the barriers to deployment in micronuclear in Alaska. And the first is the technology. They're just not built yet. But honestly, I'm not too concerned about that because the technology is moving along. There are a lot of challenges. There are supply chain challenges. We've heard pretty good discussion of that today. But I'm confident that the technology is going to get there. The second challenge, though, is I'd say a little tougher to deal with, and that's regulation. So the promise of small nuclear in Alaska is going to require a different regulatory paradigm. You know, if you want to put a plant out on a village by the river, you know, it has to be no emergency planning zone. It has to have really no seismic siting criteria. You don't have to go through the elaborate licensing process. Well, the licensing process has to take place for the plant itself, but not for when you deploy it. They've got to be able to be remotely monitored and remotely operated. It's going to be tough for the regulators to wrap their head around that kind of licensing environment. So I think regulation is the second big hurdle. But I think the third hurdle is really the toughest one, and that is getting support from the people who live in the places that these plants are going to be deployed. So to get the support and the buy-in of stakeholders is critical. To be completely frank, I think that's where the biggest gap is today. We see a lot of people come and talk about micronuclear deployment and the opportunities for it. As Clay mentioned, and as we've seen from other studies, people are generally very positive about the potential for nuclear within Alaska. But they want to know details. They don't really care what kind of coolant the reactor uses. I mean, it's cool to talk about liquid metal-cooled reactors and gas-cooled reactors, but they don't care about that. They don't care which portion of the neutron energy spectrum most of the fissions occur in, right? So they don't care if it's a fast reactor or a thermal reactor. But they want to know is, what are the risks? What are the operating impacts? How is this going to affect our community? What are you going to do with this thing when it's done? Right? Those questions come up over and over again. And I think that there has to be honest and ongoing engagement, as one of the other speakers mentioned, in order to get that acceptance from stakeholders and almost what I would call a social license to operate. And I think that's actually, assuming that the technological stuff gets fixed, assuming that we can get through the regulatory hurdles, I think that that's actually the most critical barrier and the one that deserves the most focus for deployment of micronuclear. And I'm sorry I went on way too long.
No, you're fine. Thanks, Lou. So I'm going to kick it over to Eric next. And we started our day today talking about the importance of the military, and probably even flipping it back, the importance of energy to the military. And it just seems to me that that might be a starting point for us. But I'm also curious whether there's relationships that can be between private sector and the military. How might we get going from that perspective?
Well, I would like to pull the thread later on the regulatory piece, and so if we get to that in some questions. But to your question, I think, well, I'll give you a little story. You all know Secretary Lloyd Austin as our Secretary of Defense. He used to be general officer in the military, and when he was a brigadier, we did the invasion into Iraq. We were prepping logistically, and he was often quoted as saying, "God will punish he who goes to war with one of anything." Now, what does that have to do with industry? What he was talking about is self-sufficiency and independence. And I'm going to make an assertion here, but the company or the corporation or the industry that surrenders to or is captured by regional distribution of energy resources is going to pay a heavy price. You won't control your destiny. So if I were to give you a story that you'll probably recall from 2 years ago, it would be the Colonial Pipeline. Now, this is liquid fuel, but the pipeline or aspects of it get hacked by a malign actor, and the airline industry was hostage for 10 to 12 days because of this pipeline that gets shut down. That's true for anything, and if your industry is dependent on theater distribution of energy resources, you will pay a price for it. So what does that have to do with nuclear power? Microgrids and microreactors allow independence. It allows you to get away from being vulnerable to bad weather. Read Austin, Texas in the winter 2 years ago. It avoids the challenge of being victim of malign influencers, and it avoids the influence or the risk of just bad performance. So you control your destiny with microgrids and microreactors, whether that's a small village, whether that's a radar site, whether that's some corporate industry. I think what you do is you start to shrink the targets of the single point of failure, because malign actors will go for a single point of failure that causes mass destruction. If you start to reduce your microgrid sizes, it's really hard to target on a large scale.
Thank you. Do you want to ask Lou your question now? Do you want to keep?
No, I'm going to come
Okay.
back to that one a
All
little
right,
bit later.
all right.
I got to get ready for that one.
And before I jump to Haven, if you have questions, write them down, because we are hopefully going to have a few minutes at the end of our panel to let you ask some questions. All right, Haven. I have always admired, although I recognize it's a tension for someone in your seat, but I've always admired how Native corporations in our state not only have managed to build these multi-million, someone asked me yesterday, I was like, actually, they're billion.
There's 4.
Yeah, that corporations, and simultaneously their shareholders are their residents of their communities. And so it's a little different model than some of the corporations here. And yet I am very proud, even though I'm not Native, of how the corporations have done so successful. And I do think that's a model that Alaska should be proud of. But then when I consider that from someone in your seat, you know, you have 17 villages across the Arctic. Where are you seeing the opportunities? How do you see creating a balance and meeting the needs of your communities and helping their resilience, as well as helping them develop economically?
So I want to push back on something Lou said earlier. I think, at least in the top 3, if we're talking about microreactors, and we talked about this a little bit before we came in, I think you have to include price. Because I can't justify to one of our rural communities that they should go out and invest in a microreactor in the next 5 to 10 years, knowing that today, Nome, for example, is about 48 cents a kilowatt hour. But to get to that 48 cents, there's a purchasing co-op that is run through our CDQ group, Norton Sound Economic Development Corporation. And they work with purchasing and loans for all of our villages. They have PCE, which is obviously, we've got a couple legislators in the room. I'm a former Senate staffer, other Senate staffers in the room. That's a contentious issue every year, but it's one of the things that has been a lifeblood to keep our communities going. And when we're talking about the communities in rural Alaska, unfortunately, due to a lot of effects that we have nothing we can control about, we're talking about communities in some cases that I can tell the stories of at least 2 or 3 villages that'll have their lights shut off in the next 20 years. They'll hang the sign of the last people leaving the village. I used to work for one of them that I think is going to unfortunately be in that case. So when I'm talking to our communities, I can't push something that we can't justify economically today. Now the resiliency factor, I've woken up in the morning where my dad had to turn on the stove and open it up to keep heat in the house because our power was out in the middle of the winter. And it's 25 below wind chills, 30 below wind chills. And thankfully our line crew in Nome Joint Utilities is out restoring power within a couple hours. So single points of failure, we see them in rural Alaska. If something happens, something breaks down, we are the epitome of a single point of failure, unfortunately. Now, what I do think the opportunity of nuclear power is that resiliency and that long-term stability. On the business side, I want to invest in our communities. I want to invest in our region. I want us to bring some of those rare earth minerals that were talked about earlier. The Graphite One prospect, that's 70 miles away from my hometown. I know the family that they're leasing the land from, grew up with them. So this stability that comes from leveling the playing field with a cheap, affordable, continuous power source where we're not subject to the price whims of oil and diesel fuel. That would be a game changer, because the number one thing business needs, as we talk about in all of our resources, is we need stability and we need to know what our costs are so we can pen things out. If we can do that, we can invest in our rural communities, we can invest in these rural resource extraction opportunities, and we can bring these vitally important resources to the American economy for the safety and stability of the United States. But until we get over that price hump, I don't know how we get there yet. The regulation stuff, I can't tell a community even look at investing in it when we don't know if it's actually going to be able to be regulated and have licensing in 4 or 5 years. But first and foremost, the number one thing that a community asked me was, this is what our price is. Can we get there today? And just as an anecdote and a story like we were talking about earlier, Bering Straits Native Corporation, in cooperation with one of the companies doing a lot of microreactor work, we applied for a grant through the Department of Energy. We were denied. Now, maybe we picked the wrong funding source. Maybe it wasn't the right fit for the grant application. But one of the things that we took from that was, while there's a lot of talk about the future and the money that might be available, that money's not here today because we don't have something that we can show is going to make positive change inside a community tomorrow or even a year from now. We're kind of throwing out a dream of 4, 5, 6 years. And until we can actually put pen to paper and say, we have test case, user cases that are working today, it's all a little bit of a pipe dream for a funding source.
Thank you, Avon. I appreciate those realities. I'm going to dive in a little deeper, and I really, from my perspective, I think that there's tremendous opportunity here when I think about it from a national security perspective, when I think about heat and power across our state, when I think about places like Fairbanks, and if we had a source of energy that actually could be cleaner, and that air pollution there would not be to the degree it is. And so and then I also know there's skepticism and healthy skepticism, and I also know we're an oil and gas state. Whether it's at my dinner table or with leaders across the state, I'm often reminded of that. Like, don't forget where our wealth comes from as you're, heading down this path. And so I know that we need to be thinking about all of those things, particularly as a first mover. And then Mike Wandler mentioned, we're primed to be a customer. But simultaneously, I have to be thinking about, we're only going to be an oil and gas state for so long. Mm-hmm. And we have, tremendous opportunities across our state to help, build out some of that supply chain, or, help bolster our economy through these resources. So I'm curious, and Lou, I'm going to start with you again. What are the energy challenges we have here in Alaska that need to be solved today? And do you see a pathway to resolve these challenges without incorporating nuclear? And how might nuclear support the solutions if we wait? And how long can we wait? And we need to decarbonize beyond electricity. That's been clear. So I'm curious.
Well, so there are people in this room who are much better at describing the energy challenges in Alaska today than I am. But as you mentioned, Fairbanks has got an air pollution problem. Interestingly, that's primarily due to wood burning, which is a whole different topic. But and South Central Alaska has a potential gas shortage. Over the next couple of years, we may see a lot of difficulty just moving fuel oil around if we have to switch as a state to ultra-low sulfur diesel. So we have immediate challenges that don't really help us out in the long term at all. So I think what we're discussing here is a little bit really of the longer term thinking. And longer term, one of the aspects to consider is that, so the company that I work for, Doyon Utilities, we provide the electrical, heat, water and wastewater utilities for military installations within the state of Alaska. Our largest utilities are heat utilities, not electric. So when we talk about energy, people tend to think about electrical energy. But in Alaska, heating, residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation take up the bulk of the energy that is consumed. So electrical energy is important. We tend to focus on it, but really the broader energy picture is much bigger than just supplying electricity. There has to be, especially when you talk about decarbonization. You know, in the lower 48, it's a little bit of electrify everything, right? Put heat pumps on everything, electrify all the cars. It's not quite going to work yet with the technology here in Alaska. I know that there are a lot of people working very hard on developing the technologies that will make it, but electrify Alaska is not quite there yet. So it's a monumental challenge for us. So how does nuclear fit in? Nuclear fits in because obviously it's a source of heat, right? We tend to think of using the heat to produce electricity, but it can be a source of heat as well. In Fairbanks, for example, there are already district heating systems that could be fairly easily adapted to nuclear. Now, does district heating work for everywhere? Obviously not, but nuclear has a role to play in providing the other kinds of energy that Alaskans need as well.
Excellent, thank you. And then, Eric, the Eielson project is what makes us kind of a first mover as Alaska. And then I know that you've had some experience with other emerging technologies. And I still want to keep pulling the string on this national security aspect and Alaska's need for energy security. Where is the opportunity for us to maybe to partner with the military or benefit from some of those early investments with the military?
Yeah, let me describe the national security equity in this to a degree. I sat on a panel with the Atlantic Council 3 years ago. In order to disrupt thinking and wake people up a little bit, I made the statement that I'm mildly interested in the environment as it relates to nuclear power and electrification. Obviously, everybody woke up, and it's probably why I haven't been invited back in 3 years. But my point in that was, as an operator responsible for energy needs of a theater commander, what I find more compelling, or at least as compelling, even if there was carbon emissions from nuclear power, I would still argue for it. Why? Because of the energy density that Dr. Waxman mentioned earlier. Orders of magnitude more. And you've got this exponential increase in demand for the military in terms of energy. So you got to get it from somewhere. You're not going to get it from liquid fuel. So that's sort of a background context. But it's important to know, why is this important from a national security perspective? And I think there's probably 4 things. The first is, we are an expeditionary force that goes globally. That costs a lot of money. You have to have a thriving economy to be able to have the influence that we want to have on behalf of our norms and our mores and our ethics. So that costs money, so you have to have a sustainable economy, and that comes with viable energy. The second thing, and I think most of the people in this room know, there's a whole string of pearls of radar sites on the North Slope. And they're in remote areas, and they require energy, and they have to be on, watching every day to control and protect our airspace. A 1 megawatt reactor is going to use 60 gallons of fuel an hour. That's 10,000 gallons a week. That's $6 million a year, plus all the maintenance that goes along with that and the long-haul trucking that goes along with that. That's a direct relationship between Alaska and national security and readily available power. The third thing I'd mention is we deploy from home. Always remember that. You know, you think of a theater of war in another country, we deploy from home. And so the ability to have resilient grids and resilient energy to get forces out the door very quickly is critical. Alaska plays a role in that. And then I would say, finally, I already mentioned, but moving energy on the battlefield where there's no organic grids and you have to carry your own energy really begs the question for the ability to generate power at the point of need. Organic power generation is what a theater commander needs. So those are 4 areas where I think there's some direct relationship to national security.
Excellent. All right, Haven. For me, Nome is pretty much ground zero for economic development in our state right now. There's just so much happening. It's pretty mind-boggling to me, actually. It seems like you need a troop of folks, but you can decide who to invite in. Anyways, so for those of you who aren't familiar, NOAA has proposed an ongoing port. It's right there at the heart of the Northwest Passage, and so potentially another base, who knows? I've heard talk. And then we have large investments, economic development investments like Graphite One. And I imagine you have a whole host of other things that you're thinking about as Bering Straits Native Corporation. And so when you think about those, what are you thinking about? You've already shared, we tried one opportunity and weren't there, but how are you preparing for the energy needs? I mean, that's one of the things that I'm like, energy workforce, how are they going to do all this?
Well, that's the $5 million question, or $500 million question, I should say. So if anyone has a great answer, I'll be over here in the corner when the meeting's done. No, in reality, you're right. We've got about a $500 million port project that's coming in. As a frame of reference, when I was a young man growing up in Nome, we saw maybe one or two smaller vessels come in that were not like fishing vessels, things of that nature. They'd bring in maybe 100 passengers. This year, I believe we had 16. The last one was just a couple weeks ago. There are projections that we could go up into the 30s or 40s. And we are one of the main points for the scientific worldwide voyages when they go over the Northwest Passage. They come and stop in Nome. Also, just visually, we are the hub community for the Bering Strait. When we say Bering Straits Native Corporation, we literally are that. One of our communities, Wales, you can see mainland Russia from there. We have 4 communities in our greater region. You can see mainland Russia for them. There's been a lot of articles in the last couple weeks on the oil trade from Russia going down to China to sell their oil to basically continue funding the Ukraine war effort on the Russian end. They go right down our inlet there. We have people who see them, who observe them when they're out hunting and fishing all the time. So for us, on a national security front, that's where our apprehension comes in, obviously. But with all these risks, we're putting in a $500 million port. That's the opportunity to galvanize, re-energize a community or region of 10,000 people that need that economic development. That hopefully we're going to lessen prices. We're going to be able to bring in new people for tourism and economic diversity. The energy costs. Of course, we're looking at that in conjunction with the national security aspect and the increasingly verbalized possibility of a growing military presence. Whether it's 5 people or 100 people, we have to find housing and we have to have the ability within the existing infrastructure to keep their lights on, to keep their house warm. I was really intrigued, Lou, you brought up heating earlier. When in speaking with the city of Nome about the opportunity for a nuclear plant, the thing that they grasped on most strongly was not just the power generation. They were most excited about the heating opportunities. How would we be able to get that out to either our largest base users, the hospital, we have the regional jail in Nome, the school, other large facilities, but they're also excited, can we push that into some of our new home developments? Because that is what's going to drive the cost down for the consumer. So we're looking at all those, and then on the back end, like I said, we have 2.1 million acres region-wide, both surface and subsurface, varying degrees. We're looking at the opportunity to get out there. Graphite One is really stealing the headlines, obviously, in Alaska as a large potential mine. That is something that we invested $2 million in recently. That was in the news, so it's not a secret. We're hoping that that's going to be an economic engine for us in our region on a smaller scale, but much in the vein of the Red Dog mine. So all of these things are areas where, again, they sound great when you talk about them, but when you start peeling back the layer, we need effective, cheap energy. And given the fluctuations of the oil industry, as much as we love it here in Alaska, and state coffers are going to boom in the next year if these oil prices stay high, but they also hit our pocketbooks hard. And it makes it really hard to plan for the future and to plan how you're going to pay for things. So if we can find a baseline cost, again, I'm going to reiterate, a baseline cost that we can depend on, you can start penciling out projects. You can start penciling out development and investment in rural areas. And we just need these things to keep these areas alive, because There has been a drawdown in the percentage of people living in rural Alaska statewide, and I want my friends and family, if they choose to stay in their home communities, to be able to do that for the next 50, 100 years. And that's something the Bering Straits Native Corporation and the other ANCs, we have imperative responsibilities. We don't get to look at 5, 10 years of life. We have to look at 50, 100, 500 years of possibility, because we're not just a corporation. We are a part of the tribal sovereignty and the responsibility that the federal government has as a trust responsibility to our people.
Excellent. Thanks, Haven. And I'm going to kind of circle back a little bit, economic development, wealth creation. I'm just going to keep reiterating that. I know everyone's sick of that, but that's the key for us in Alaska. And whether, how we're getting there, and even as customers, having the ability then to use that energy source to create wealth in other ways that we've, clearly outlined here. I've been really struck with this, and it's actually something across my career. We can act individually, or we can act collectively. And I'm curious, you all bring kind of this unique perspective. We're in this significantly large state, the largest state in the nation, yet we have a very small population, and so sometimes that creates some challenges. We have unique advantages. We're co-located with Canada, and not quite as contiguous as we'd like to be with the rest of the U.S., and so that creates some opportunities for us. And we have these wonderful relationships that are still emerging with Wyoming and Utah and Idaho. Given all that, where do you think we should start? What sort of matchmaking do some of us on the economic development side, those of us that are, working with utilities, what is it that these various players need? So Lou, as a utility, do you ever see aligning with other utilities as a buyer of new nuclear?
I think that's a possibility. What I will say is, whether it's another utility or another entity, I think there has to be a real strategic partnership. As you mentioned, Alaska is a big place, but it's a small community, and the businesses here are relatively small. Even with micronuclear applications, even if they pencil out beautifully and it shows that the levelized cost of energy is clearly advantageous, it's still a big upfront capital cost. And so for any of the Alaska companies, that's going to be significant. So I would see that both for capital and for stakeholder buy-in, that involvement of the regional Native corporations is critical. As well, I would see that there's potential for partnership with incumbent nuclear operators from the lower 48. So although it might be a very different licensing regime and regulatory regime, until we develop our own expertise, I think it's gonna, we're gonna probably have to look to some people who have already done nuclear power a little bit. And then within the state, I think it would make sense to look to other utilities, especially kind of the contiguous utilities, for joint development of assets. So I think every step of the way, this is going to have to be partnerships on the private side as well as getting aligned on the government side. I think the first mover here is the project out at Eielson Air Force Base, and that one is it's so critical. It's just got to succeed. But if there are going to be a second, a third, and think about the hundreds of microgrids there are in Alaska. What would it be like if we had 50 installations out there and others? You'd need a pretty big consortium of people working together in order to operate that. Now, I think after a point, synergies would develop. Alaska itself would become kind of the center of expertise and excellence in nuclear operations, but we're going to have to partner up to get there, I think.
Thanks, Lou. And I love to hear the 50 number. I mean, one of my questions is, as a vendor, I'm assuming you need a book of 10, book of 15, 20. I mean, you've got to be able to start creating some economies of scale. And so I'm curious, I'm going to keep digging into this. I know you're no longer military, but how might we leverage some of those relationships, and whether it's on the state side or the federal side, to get to that book of 10, so that we had, a vision for getting to 50, but we could start helping vendors incrementally move forward?
So this is a good question, because I think it was earlier that Dr. Waxman has said, and I think this is true, and I beat this all the time: if Pele goes to the dome, it's tested, it's successful, and we haven't done other things, we will have failed. Because you meet this valley of death that has not been enabled, or the ecosystem of the industry has not been enabled across the supply chain. And that's, I think, a big problem. Joe Miller did a great job casting the vision of where BWXT wants to go. But I'm concerned, frankly, that the government is going to be a major stumbling block. If I could just talk about a few of those things for a minute. I don't think tech is a barrier to this. Tech is going to happen. Now, I don't mean to undermine the hard work that has to happen from BWXT, Dr. Waxman, Radiant, some of these other, it's hard work. But it's going to happen. There's some really smart people there. The concern is a number of things. And the first is I think that it's bureaucracy. Bureaucracy and policy eats tech development for breakfast. We can have the best tech in the world, but if we leave us to our own devices in the government, and I'm a recovering government guy, right? We will eat technology's lunch. So the Dr. Strangelove era regulatory regime that exists has got to be broken in order to enable industry. How does a startup make its way through the bureaucracy of a regulatory regime that was controlled and developed by the government in its origins? That's problematic. The second, in addition to regulatory regime, this access to HALU is crazy right now. It is policy crime to only have one company in the market, even though there's competitors who don't have access to build a prototype. That's criminal. I also work in combat vehicle development, and just recently there was a down select on a particular combat vehicle to GDLS and the other one to Rheinmetall. BAE got boxed out. But do you think BAE isn't going to continue to develop a combat vehicle to compete? They can, and they can bend metal and improve their product all day long. The government has a monopoly on the fuel. So you can't go in and compete if one company has all the HALU. That's crazy if you're trying to build an ecosystem that is effective. Which brings me to your price point issue. Is you're not going to bring the price point down. BWXT does great work, but you're not going to bring the price point down if there is only one company in the nation. Do we believe in that? That's not the way we operate. We're a free enterprise organization that makes ourselves all better, so the government needs to really throttle back in order to enable entrepreneurs to get into this space. So what can Alaska do, right? I would argue, Dr. Goff is going to hate me after this question's answered, but we should gang tackle Dr. Goff and say, okay, how do we solve this problem? The delegation from Alaska should be engaged with DOE, NRC, and asking these hard questions. How do we reduce the barriers to entry? I'll come over next to you, Dr. Goff, after this. I'll take care of you.
Wow. I didn't mean to hit a nerve, but thank you. Yeah, no, that's very insightful information. And I'm probably going to hit a nerve with you now, even. So I'm sorry. So I've long thought if the Native corporations joined forces, you all would be unstoppable. How might you join forces to advance nuclear in our state? Are you all talking about that at all?
I would say there's no coordinated effort that I'm aware of. If there is one, they haven't let me in the door yet. I guess I don't have the secret handshake for that meeting. That concept has been discussed on a lot of big projects. I know that as far back as 20 years ago, there was discussions, could the Native Corps, along with the tribal entities, help push forward gas line potentially? And There's been all those discussions, and in general, the Alaska Native corporations are pretty resource favorable, but we want to do it responsibly and safely. I think, you can see the pushback on the Pebble Mine as a great example, where pretty much consensus-wide, the Alaska Native corporations, now there were some village corps, I want to put that disclaimer out there, that we're working pretty collaboratively with Pebble, but for the most part, the Alaska Native corporations and tribal entities said, no, Pebble makes us too afraid. The flip side is you have the Red Dog Mine, the world's largest zinc mine, and that has been wholly embraced. And so I think when you're looking at nuclear, as an example, kind of following along these trains, one, there's still like discussed earlier, there's still so many questions on a community level. And each community is going to have a very different visceral reaction. My home region, we don't have big rivers. We have the Unacleet River, we got the Nome River. I'm trying to think of other large rivers in our region. I see a gentleman from Chalista in the back. He's got the Yukon River. He's got the Kuskokwim River. Those are rivers that go hundreds and thousands of miles. And if you have an issue with a nuclear plant there, or even the fear of an issue with a nuclear plant there, they're going to squash any opportunity immediately. And they have to, because so much of their livelihood is based on those rivers. So this is really going to be a case-by-case basis. Now, on an economic feasibility prospect, should there be some collaborative business maybe run and owned that is looking at nuclear sales? Potentially. I mean, we have another ANC-owned business up here on the stage. But again, we also always are having to look out legally, because we are state-ran corporations. We have to be looking out financially for the best interest of our shareholder. And that's always a give and a take, a pull. We want to make sure that we provide the best benefits for our shareholders while also trying to do a greater good. So it's hard to envision a 12 company or 12 person board where each of the ANCs is sitting there and we can get a unanimous consent to go do a business that is as fraught potentially as energy in general, much less something that we don't have a regulation, a licensing process, because the bureaucracy can hold things up at any time soon. But that's not to say that there couldn't be a joint venture between 2 or 3 where they're really going out and working collaboratively in rural Alaska, whether it's for mining or trying to set up microgrid opportunities.
Excellent. Yeah, and I knew trying to get all working together. But I think things will happen when a few, as you mentioned, start collecting.
If I
Please.
could, I think going back to economy of scale, if we knew there were 10, 15 communities that could actually absorb and pay for microreactors along with a few anchor projects, that would be a different discussion. That would get people to a table, whether it's 1 corporation, 10 corporations, or a mix of native corporation, non-native. But until we can say, Bethel can take 2 because of their size, Nome can take 1, Kotzebue can take 1, Utqiagvik can take 1, and then we're going to put 5 in Prudhoe, and we're going to hit Hooper Bay and Dillingham and Unalaska. I'm just picking on the biggest areas in rural Alaska right now, forgive me. And we can put at least a plant or 2 in each one, and everyone can cooperatively go in a pretty succinct timeline. We're just not going to hit that economy of scale yet. And that's why, as we're talking about it, I was really trying to think, how do you layer this in? Listening to Lou and then Eric, I think it's going to have to start from the inside out, where we're going to have to see something start on a rail belt level, because then we have a purchasing power. We just don't have that if you're looking at the rural sites today, unless we have large-scale mines that are started up and we can leverage those opportunities.
Yeah, I'm curious if the economic development potential in the large-scale mines could help drive that. Yeah. All right, I have lots more questions for you guys, but in the interest of keeping our audience engaged, I would love to hear if there's any questions from the audience. Everyone is already fully informed. Not a 1? I'm shocked.
What is the first panel after lunch?
Yeah.
We must have just answered everything so thoroughly, we're done.
I can't imagine that. All right. Yeah, thank you, Jess.
Yeah, Jess Jean, Idaho National Lab. I'm kind of curious, and Haven, your comment on these small communities being able to pay for reactors. There are other business models, like power purchase agreements where somebody else capitalizes this, sees an opportunity for a long-term power purchase agreement. Do you see that as a viable model or a more likely model than what you propose, which say the grid? We had discussion earlier on grid and microreactors that the economics may not initially work there, so that might be a challenge.
I think that my concern for small communities, and you got to remember, when you're looking at rural Alaska in particular, I would say Bethel's the largest community in rural Alaska today. Because when I look at rural Alaska, I look off the road system. And I exclude the southeast, so I shouldn't exclude Ketchikan and other communities. But I think of Western Alaska predominantly. Bethel's the largest community, and it's roughly 8,000 people. It's got a regional mass of about 26,000 people split across 53 villages. And, the size of that area it's multiple states big. So it's just trying to envision tying everything together so that you can make even a 7-10 year depreciation schedule, amortization schedule work. It's just really hard to see. And that's where I keep coming back to, Christi was calling it the book of 10. If you can get 10 microreactors in, maybe you can distribute through power purchase agreements with one entity that cost. But until we find that, I just have a hard time seeing it because someone's going to have to pay for the cost eventually. And I don't know what corporation right now is going to put $100 million up to do a 50-year amortization on that book of business without a guaranteed backlog, knowing that in 7 to 12 years, you're probably going to have to refresh the system anyways. So it just becomes really difficult to see where Bering Straits, even as a decent-sized company in Alaska, is going to be able to put that money up front. Now, we can work collaboratively with our communities, but every house, every business that comes online helps spread that cost out. And until we have that base, I just don't know how we're going to pay for it. Now, having said that, there are grants. I know there are grants. There are loan programs. And maybe we've got a couple of legislators in the building, and they would like to set up funds someday to help pay for these things. But until we have that, I think we're still struggling, and we're putting a lot of emphasis on either very small communities with low tax bases, or we're hoping to find anchor projects like Graphite One, Donlin Creek, etc.
Excellent points. Any other questions from the audience? Thank you for that one, Jess. So that gives you each a minute or two to kind of give us a bow around the box. Like we've covered a lot of territory here, unraveled like some obstacles. We also need to I would prefer that we end up on some kind of high note. So I think we've kind of
no more rants.
We can rant. We can rant because I think the rants help us. This is about learning. So rants help us learn. But where do we go from here? I mean, I've asked this earlier in the day. Most of the panelists or the moderators have asked, like, what do we need to do? This is a launch of a conversation. What do we need to do to keep this conversation going and to address some of the challenges, that we're not just coming back a year, 2 years from now and being like, so we talked about this before. Where are we? Lou, do you mind starting us off?
No, not at all. In the near term, I just see issues and concerns. But I have to say, long term, I'm very optimistic because there is, I think, a tremendous groundswell of work being done and recognition that the current solutions to energy problems that have worked up here as well as other places over many decades simply are not going to be viable into the future, and that it's going to come around, right? So to some extent, I'm kind of a believer in the inevitability of the technology, and so I'm an unreasonable optimist in that regard. I just say when you come around to it, it's the best solution. Now, if somebody says, here, we've invented really cheap carbon sequestration, we're going to do that, I'm like, well, that's great. But for feasible technologies, I just see this as almost inevitable. I don't see everybody who lives in Alaska pulling up stakes and moving away. Long term, this is an incredibly rich resource for the United States, as well as a tremendously important place for everybody who's lived here and people who have lived here for thousands of years. And so I just think that it's struggle, 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 but at the end of the day, we get to where nuclear becomes almost foundational to the way of life in Alaska. I think that's a realizable vision.
Thanks.
So I think, listen, Joe was just brilliant earlier when he talked about the future of nuclear power. It's inevitable, and it's got to come one way or the other. I think what I would wrap up with, there are barriers, but you know, there are three entities that will solve the problem. The utility companies, the native corporations, and the government, right? And those three come together in the most special and intimate way across the nation here in Alaska. And with Alaska's role in our national security and the fact that that relationship is most intimate here in this state, I think there's a leadership obligation on the part of those three entities to come together to craft that strategy forward.
I love that vision.
So I've been a naysayer up here for the last 35, 40 minutes. Funny enough, as an 18-year-old at Nome Belts High School, I wrote a paper in my physics class on fission versus fusion and the future. Turned it into the University of Michigan to get it was part of my application process, and ultimately got a political science degree, which is weird when you think I submitted a physics paper to get into college. I'm a firm believer that nuclear is a part of the story. I think it has to happen. I think for rural Alaska, for large projects, we do need that baseline energy production that can survive a lot of the fluctuations of the future. I'm hopeful that we're all correct and the technology does happen, and that is the least of our concerns. My vision is that in 2 years we would be having similar discussions because we don't have the regulatory aspect yet. But I think what we need to continue is the education of the general population of Alaska to understand where and why the people that are in this room predominantly probably feel nuclear is a part of our greater aspect. We're still going to need to extract our resources. That takes a tremendous amount of power. We want to continue advocating for clean oil and gas production where we do it better than anywhere else in the world. But in our own house, we still need to best predict and best build out our infrastructure to survive for 50 to 100 years, 1,000 years, so that people can stay in Alaska while we're taking advantage of our extraction state status. And so I have a firm vision that, yeah, in 5 to 10 years, we probably are beginning to see plants come online. I just think we have to be realistic in that we're going to need to overcome a lot of financial hurdles because we have so many small patches of population in the state. So I don't want to end on being the naysayer that says, no, I don't think it's going to happen, because that's the exact opposite of how I feel. But I also think if we don't openly address the limitations of some of our population base and the difficulty that that presents, we're really selling ourselves short and not showing the full picture.
Love it. So I just feel so privileged to have been able to spend some time with each of you and to learn from each of you. And I really appreciate the vision that you just shared. And join me in thanking them.